the inadequacy of natural science for the knowledge of the life of the soul. In the lectures given during this week, we discussed much that can lead us to understand the nature of the human being in connection with the historical development of humanity, in such a way as to enable us to gradually form a conception of necessity and free will. Such questions can be less easily decided by means of definitions and combinations of words than by bringing together the relevant truths from the spiritual world. In our age, humanity must become more and more accustomed to acquiring a different way of understanding reality from the one so prevalent today, which, after all, holds to very secondary and nebulous concepts bound up with the definitions of words. If we consider what certain persons who think themselves especially clever write and say, we have the feeling that they speak in concepts and ideas that are only apparently clear. In reality, however, they are as lacking in clarity as if someone were to speak of a certain object that is made out of a gourd, so that the gourd is transformed into a bottle and used as such. We can then call this object a gourd, for it is a gourd in reality, but we can also call it a bottle, for it is used as a bottle. Indeed, the things we speak of are first determined by the connections we are dealing with. As soon as we no longer rely upon words when we are speaking, but upon a certain perception, then everyone will know whether we mean a bottle or a gourd. But then we may not confine ourselves to a description or a definition of the object, because as long as we do so, it can just as well be a gourd as a bottle. In a similar way, many philologists, who consider themselves very clever, speak today of what may be the human soul, but may also be the human body. It may be a gourd or it may be a bottle. I include in this remark a great deal of what is taken seriously at the present time, partly to the detriment of humanity. For this reason, it is necessary that the anthroposophically oriented spiritual science we should strive. For this reason, it is necessary that with anthroposophically oriented spiritual science we should strive for clear, precise thinking, which is above all a necessity. This is a striving to perceive the world not in the way customary today, not by confusing the gourd and the bottle, but to see everywhere what is real, be it outer physical reality or spiritual reality. We cannot, in any case, arrive at a real concept of what comes into consideration for the human being when we hold only to definitions and the like. We can do so only when we bear in mind the relationships of life in their reality. And just where such important concepts as freedom, free will, and necessity in social and moral life are concerned, we attain clarity only when we place side by side spiritual facts, such as those brought out in these lectures, and when we always strive to weigh the one against the other to reach a judgment of reality. Bear in mind that over and over again, both here and in public lectures, I have brought out with a certain intensity and from the most varied points of view the fact that we can only rightly grasp what we call concepts when we bring them into relation with our bodily organization. And we have to do this in a way that we do not see the basis of concepts in the body as something growing and flourishing, but just the opposite, as something partially dying in the body. I have expressed this in a public lecture by saying that human beings really die continually in their nervous system. The nerve process must limit itself to the nervous system, because if the same thing happened in the rest of the organism as what goes on in the nerves, this would mean the death of the human being at every moment. We may say that concepts arise where the organism deteriorates. For this reason, spiritual science must pursue other processes, besides the ascending processes that natural science of today considers definitive. These ascending processes are the processes of growth. They reach their summit within the unconscious. Only when the organism begins to develop the processes of decline does the activity of the soul appear that we designate as conceptual, or indeed as sense perception. This process of deterioration, this slow process of death, must exist if thinking is to occur. I have shown that the free actions of human beings rest upon just the fact that human beings can seek the impulses for their actions out of pure thoughts. These pure thoughts have the most influence upon the processes of disintegration in the human organism. What happens in reality when we perform a free deed? Let us explain what happens when ordinary people perform an act out of moral imagination. This means out of a thinking not ruled by sense impulses, desires, or passions. What really takes place? We give ourselves up to pure thoughts. These form our impulses. Thoughts are mere mirror pictures. They belong to Maya. Mirror pictures cannot impel us through what they are. The impulses must come from us. Human beings must compel themselves under the influence of pure thoughts. Pure thoughts work most strongly upon the process of deterioration in the human organism. So we may say that on the one side the process of disintegration arises out of the organism, and on the other the pure deed thought, German Tatgedanke, comes out of the spiritual world to meet this deterioration process. I mean by this the thought that lies at the basis of the deed. Free actions arise by uniting these two through the interaction of the process of deterioration and the deed thought. I said that pure thinking does not cause the process of deterioration. In fact, this process is always there. If the human being does not oppose these processes of disintegration with something coming out of pure thinking, then the disintegrating process is not transformed into an upbuilding process, and a part that is slowly dying remains within the human being. If you think this through, you will see that if we do not act out of freedom, we fail to arrest a death process within ourselves. Therein lies one of the subtlest thoughts that we must accept. Anyone who understands this thought can no longer have any doubt in life about the existence of human freedom. An action that is performed in freedom does not occur through something caused within the organism, but occurs where the cause ceases. In other words, out of a process of disintegration. There must be something underlying the organism where the causes cease. Only then can the pure thought, as motive of the action, set in. But such disintegrating processes are always there. They only remain unused to a certain extent when the human being does not perform free deeds. But this also shows the characteristics of an age that will have nothing to do with an understanding of the idea of freedom in its widest extent. The age running from the second half of the 19th century up to the present has set itself the particular task of dimming down more and more the knowledge of freedom in all spheres of life, and of excluding it entirely from practical life. People do not wish to understand freedom. They do not want freedom. Philosophers have made every effort to prove that everything arises out of human nature through a certain necessity. Certainly a necessity underlies human nature. But this necessity ceases as deterioration processes begin, in which the connection of the causes comes to an end. When freedom has set in at the point where the necessity in the organism ceases, One cannot say that the human being's actions arise out of an inner necessity, for they arise only when this necessity ceases. The whole mistake arises from the fact that people have been unwilling to understand not only the upbuilding processes in the organism, but also the disintegrating processes. However, to understand what really underlies the nature of the human being, we must develop a greater capacity to do this than exists in our age. Yesterday we saw how necessary it is to be able to look with the eye of the soul upon what we call the human capital I. But in our times, human beings are not very gifted in comprehending this reality of the capital I. I will provide proof of this. I have often referred to the remarkable scientific achievement of Theodor Ziehen, titled Die Physiologische Psychologie, Physiological Psychology. Ziehen speaks of the I, but is never in a position to indicate the real I. He speaks merely of the I concept, which we know is only a mirror picture of the real I. But it is particularly interesting to hear how a distinguished thinker of today, but one who believes that he can exhaust everything with natural scientific ideas, speaks about the I. Ziehen says, quote, "It will perhaps occur to you that the I concept that is expressed in the small word I is a very complex threefold entity containing thousands and thousands of partial concepts. But I beg you to ponder this. The word is indeed short, but its conceptual content must be complex, as shown by the fact that each one of you would be at a loss if you were asked to give the thought content of your so-called I concept." Close quote. And now Ziehen attempts to say something about the thought content of the I concept. Let us now see what the distinguished scholar has to say concerning what we must really think when we think about our I. Quote, "You will immediately think of your body." You notice that he says that you will think of your body. That's in parentheses. I'm assuming that's Steiner speaking. Let me read that again. Quote, "You will immediately think of your body." Parenthesis. You notice that he says that you will think of your body. Close parenthesis. "Of your relationships to the outer world, your family, and your personal possessions." Parenthesis. "Thus you will soon begin to think of your bank account and to count your money." Close parenthesis. "Of your name and title." Parenthesis. Now the distinguished scholar emphatically points out that we must also think of our name and of our title if we are to grasp or encompass our I in the form of concept. Close parenthesis. "Your principal inclinations, predominating ideas, and finally your past, and thus prove to yourself how extremely complex this I concept is." Indeed, reflective human beings reduce this complexity of the I concept to a relative simplicity by placing their own I as the subject of their feelings, thoughts, and movements against the outer objects and the I's of others. Of course, this contrast and this sharpening of the I concept also has its deeper scientific and philosophical basis. But considered purely psychologically, this simple I is only a theoretical fiction. Close quote. Thus, this simple I is only a theoretical fiction, which means a mere fantasy concept that constructs itself when we put together our name, title, and possibly our rank, and other such things that make us important. Through such points, we can see the whole weakness of the current way of thinking. And this weakness must be held in mind all the more firmly, because of the fact that what proves to be a decided weakness for the knowledge of the life of the soul is a strength for the knowledge of outer natural scientific facts. Precisely what is inadequate for knowledge of the life of the soul is adequate for penetrating the facts of the senses in their immediate outer necessity. We must not deceive ourselves about the fact that it is a characteristic of our times that people who may be great in one field are exponents of the greatest nonsense in another. Only when we hold this fact, which is so well adapted to throw sand in the eyes of humanity, clearly in mind, can we in any way follow with active thought what is required to raise again the power humanity needs to acquire thoughts that can penetrate into life fruitfully and with healing. For we can take firm hold of life as it is today only with thoughts drawn out of the depths of true reality, where we are not afraid to reach deeply into true reality. Many people shy away today from precisely this. At present, people are very often inclined to reform spiritual reality, without first having perceived the true reality from which they should draw their impulses. Who today does not go about reforming everything in the world, or at least believes he or she can reform it? What do people not draw up out of sheer nothingness of the soul? At a time like this, only things drawn up from the depths of spiritual reality itself can be fruitful. The will for this must be present. The vanity that wishes to take up every possible idea of reform on the basis of emptiness of soul is just as harmful for the development of our present time as materialism itself. At the conclusion of yesterday's lecture, I called your attention to how the true I of the human being, the I that indeed belongs to the will nature, and therefore is immersed in sleep for the ordinary consciousness, must be fructified, because already through public instruction people are led to a concrete grasping of the great interests of the times. Spiritual forces and activities enter into our occurrences and processes and have an influence upon them. This cannot be accomplished with generalized, nebulous talk about the spirit, but with knowledge of the concrete spiritual processes and events as we have described them in these lectures, where we have indicated, according to dates, how here and there certain of these powers and forces from the spiritual world have intervened here in the physical. This brought about what I was able to describe to you as the joint work of the so-called dead and of the so-called living in the whole development of humanity. For the reality of our life of feeling and of will is in the realm where the dead also are. We can say that the reality of our I and of our astral body is in the same realm where the dead can also be found. This, however, indicates a common realm where we are embedded, where the dead and the living work together upon the tapestry that we may call the social, moral, and historical life of the human being in its totality. The periods of existence we live through between death and a new birth also belong to this realm. We have indicated in these lectures how between death and a new birth the so-called dead have the animal kingdom as their lowest kingdom, just as the mineral kingdom is our lowest kingdom. We have also pointed out, in a certain way, how the dead have to work within the beings of the animal kingdom and have to build up, out of the laws working in the animal nature, the organization that forms the basis for their next incarnation. A second kingdom arises for the dead that is woven together of all the karmic connections they have established during any earthly incarnation, and that, correspondingly transformed, continue within the spiritual world. Through this, however, all of the interests the human being has developed between death and a new birth gradually spread themselves out, one might say quite concretely, over the whole of humanity. The human being then passes through a third kingdom that can be conceived as the kingdom of the angels. In a certain sense, we have already pointed out the role of the angels during the life between death and a new birth. They carry, so to speak, the thoughts from one human soul to another and back again. They are the messengers of the common life of thought. Fundamentally speaking, the dead have the clearest living experience of those beings among the higher hierarchies we call the angels. They have a clear, living experience of the relationships with animals and human beings, established through karma. But among the beings of the higher hierarchies, the dead have the clearest conception of those belonging to the hierarchy of the angels, who are really the bearers of thoughts, indeed, of the soul content from one being to another, and who also help the dead work on the animal nature. When we speak of the concerns of the dead as personal concerns, we might say that the angels must strive primarily to look after the personal concerns of the dead. The more universal and less personal affairs of the dead are looked after more by the beings of the kingdom of the archangeloi and archai. If you recall my lecture cycle titled The Inner Nature of Man and Life Between Death and Rebirth, Collected Works 153, you will remember that it is the nature of the life of the so-called dead that they spread out their being over the world and draw it together again within themselves. The life of the dead takes its course in such a way that a kind of alternation takes place between day and night, but so that active life arises from within them. They know that this active life that arises is only the reappearance of what they experienced in that other state that alternates with this one, when their being is spread out over and united with the outer world. Thus, when we come into contact with the dead, we meet alternating conditions. In one condition, their being is spread out over the world, where they grow into the real existence of their surroundings, into the events of their surroundings. The other condition, which the dead know least of all, is the time when their own being, in a kind of sleeping state, grows into the spiritual world around them. When this again rises up within them, it constitutes a kind of waking state, and they are aware of everything, for their life takes its course within time and not in space. Just as with our day-waking consciousness, we have outside in space what we take up in our consciousness and then withdraw from again in sleep, so the dead take over into the next period of time the experiences they passed through in a former period of time. These experiences then fill their consciousness. It is a life entirely within time, and we must become familiar with this. Through this rhythmic life within time, the dead enter into a very definite relationship with the archangeloi and archai. They do not have as clear a conception of these archangeloi and archai as they have of the angels, the human being, and the animal. Above all, the dead always have the conception that the archai and archangeloi work together with them in this rhythm of waking and falling asleep within the course of time. When the dead can develop a consciousness of what they experienced unknowingly in the preceding period of time, they always have the consciousness that a being of the hierarchy of the archai has awakened them. They are always conscious that they work together with the archai and the archangeloi in all that concerns this rhythmic life. Let us firmly grasp the fact that just as in a waking state we realize that we perceive the outer world that we know nothing of during sleep, just as we realize that this outer world sinks into darkness when we fall asleep, so in the soul of the so-called dead lives this consciousness. I am united in a common work with archai and archangeloi, so that I may pass through this life of falling asleep and awaking, falling asleep and awaking, and so on. We might say that the dead associate with the archangeloi and archai just as in waking consciousness we associate with the plant and mineral world of our physical surroundings. Human beings cannot, however, look back during life on earth upon this interplay of forces in which they are interwoven between death and a new birth. Why not? This looking back is something that we must learn, yet it is difficult to learn this because of the materialistic mentality of today. I would like to show you, in a diagram, why people do not look back upon this. Let us suppose that you are facing the world with all your organs of perception and understanding. This will give you a conceptual and perceptive content of a most varied kind. I will designate the consciousness of a single moment by drawing different rings or small circles. You know that a memory process takes place when you look back over events, though in a different manner than modern psychologists imagine. The time into which you can look back, to which your memory extends, is indicated by this vertical line. It really indicates the place that here reaches a blind alley. This would be the point in your 3rd, 4th, or 5th year, which is as far back as you can remember in life. Thus all the thoughts and pictures that arise when you look back upon your past experiences lie within this space of time. Let us suppose that you think of something in your 30th year, and while you are thinking of this, you remember something that you experienced 10 years ago. If you picture very vividly what is actually taking place in the soul, you will be able to form the following thought. If I look back to the point of time in my childhood as far back as I can remember, this constitutes a sac in the soul, which has its limits. Its curved end is the point that lies as far back in my childhood as I am able to remember. This is a sort of sac in the soul. It is the space of time that we can grasp in memory. Imagine such a soul sac into which you can look while you are looking back in memory. These are the extreme limits of the sac that correspond in reality to the limit between the etheric body and the physical. This boundary must exist. Otherwise, to picture it roughly, the events that call forth memory would then always fall through at this point. You would be able to remember nothing. The soul would be a sack without a bottom, and everything would fall through it. Thus a boundary must be there. An actual soul sac must be there. But at the same time, this soul sac prevents you from perceiving what you have lived through outside it. You yourself are non-transparent in the life of your soul, because you have the faculty of memory. You see, therefore, what causes us to have a proper consciousness for the physical plane is at the same time the cause of our being unable to look with our ordinary consciousness into the region that lies behind memory. But we can make the effort to gradually transform our memories to some extent. However, we must do this carefully. We can begin by trying to keep before us in meditation, with more and more accuracy, something that we can remember, until we feel that it is not merely something we take hold of in memory, but something that really remains there. One who develops an intensive, active life of the spirit will gradually have this feeling that memory is not something that comes and goes, but that memory contains something permanent. Indeed, work in this direction can only lead to the conviction that what rises within memory has a lasting nature, and really remains present as Akashic record, for it does not disappear. What we remember remains in the world. It is there, in reality. But we do not progress any further with this method, because merely to remember accurately our personal experiences, and to attain the knowledge that memory remains is, in a higher sense, too egotistical to lead further than just to this conviction. On the contrary, if you were to develop beyond a certain point just this capacity of looking upon the permanency of your own experiences, you would obstruct all the more your sight into the free world of spirit. Instead of the sack of memories, your own life stands there all the more compactly and prevents you from looking through. Another method may be used in contrast to this, and through it the impressions in the Akashic record become remarkably transparent, if I may use this expression. When we are once able to look through the stationary memories, we look with a sure eye, EYE, into the spiritual world with which we are connected between death and a new birth. But to attain this, we must not use merely the stationary memories of our own life. These become more and more compact, and we can see through them less and less. They must become transparent. And they become transparent if we make an ever stronger attempt to remember. Not so much what we have experienced from out of our own point of view, but more what has come to us from outside. Instead of remembering, for instance, what we have learned, we should remember the teachers, their manner of speech, their way of working, and what they did with us. We should try to remember how the book came into being from which we learned this or that. We should remember above all what worked upon us from the outside world. A beautiful and really wonderful beginning, indeed an introduction to such a memory, is Goethe's title Wahrheit und Dichtung, his memoirs published in English as Truth and Poetry, where he shows how time formed him, how various forces worked upon him. Because Goethe was able to achieve this in his life and looked back on his life, not from the standpoint of his own experiences, but from the standpoint of others and of the events of the times that worked upon him, he was able to have such deep insight into the spiritual world. But this is at the same time the way that enables us to come more deeply in touch with the time that has taken its course between our last death and our present birth. Thus you see that today I refer, from another point of view, to the same thing that I already discussed. To extend our interests beyond the personal, to turn our interests and attention not upon ourselves, but upon what has formed us, and from where we have arisen. It is an ideal to be able to look back upon time, upon a remote antiquity, and to investigate all the forces that have formed the person we have become. Indeed, when we describe it thus, we see few difficulties. However, it is no simple task. It is a task that brings great success, because it requires great selflessness. It is precisely this method that awakens the forces that enable us to enter with our I, capital, into the sphere that the dead have in common with the living. The task of public instruction is in a not too distant future, will be less to know ourselves, but more to know our time in its concrete reality. Not time as it now stands in history books, but as it has evolved out of spiritual impulses. Thus we are also led to extend our interest to a characteristic of our age and its rise from the universal world process. Why did Goethe strive so intensely to know Greek art, to understand his age through and through, and to weigh it against earlier ages? Why did he make his Faust go back as far as the Greek age, as far as the age of Helen of Troy, and seek Chiron and the Sphinxes? He did this because he wished to know his own age, and how it had worked upon him, as he could know it only by measuring it against an earlier age. However, Goethe does not let his Faust sit still and decipher old documents and state records. He leads him back along paths of the soul to the impulses by which he himself has been formed. Within him lies much of what leads the human being, on the one hand, to a meeting with the dead, and on the other hand with the spirits of time and the archangels. This is now evident through the connection of the dead with the archangels. Through the fact that human beings come together with the dead, they also come in touch with the archangels and with the spirits of time. These impulses, which Goethe indicated in his Faust, contain what human beings extend their interests through to the time spirit. Let me read that again. These impulses, which Goethe indicated in his Faust, contain what human beings extend their interests through to the time spirit, and these impulses contain what is preeminently necessary for our times. It is indeed necessary for our times to look in a different way at things, such as, for instance, Faust, the title. Most of those who study Faust can hardly find the real problems contained in it. A few are able to formulate questions, but the answers are most curious. Take, for example, the passage where Goethe really indicates to us that we should reflect. Do people always reflect at this point? Yet Goethe spares no effort to make it clearly understood that people should reflect upon certain things. For instance, you know that Erichtho speaks about the sight of the classical Walpurgis night. She withdraws, and the air traveller, Homunculus, appears with Faust and Mephistopheles. You will recall the first speeches of Homunculus, Mephistopheles, and Faust. After Faust has touched the ground and called out, "Where is she?" Homunculus says, quote, "It's more than we can tell, but to inquire would here be well. Thou'rt free to hasten ere the day from flame to flame and seek her so. Who to the mothers found his way has nothing more to undergo." Close quote. Homunculus says, who to the mothers found his way has nothing more to undergo. How does he know that Faust has been with the mothers? This is a question that must arise, for if you look back through the book, you will find no indication anywhere that Homunculus, as a distinct and separate being from Faust, could have known that Faust had been with the mothers. Now, suddenly, Homunculus pipes out that who to the mothers found his way has nothing more to undergo. You see, Goethe propounds riddles. With clear-cut necessity it follows that Homunculus, if he is anything at all, is something within the sphere of consciousness of Faust himself, for that is the only way he can know what is contained in the sphere of Faust's consciousness. Call to mind the various expositions we have given of Faust, how Homunculus is really nothing else than what must be prepared as astral body, so that Helen may appear. But for this reason he is in another state of consciousness. His consciousness is spread out over the astral body. When Homunculus comes within the sphere of Faust's consciousness, we have the possibility of understanding his knowledge. Goethe makes Homunculus come into existence because, through the creation of Homunculus, Faust's consciousness finds the possibility of transcending itself, as it were, not merely remaining within itself, but being outside. Goethe, as you see, takes alchemy very seriously. There are many such riddles in Faust that are directly connected with the secrets of the spiritual world. We must allow Faust to work upon us, so that we become aware of the depths of spiritual reality that are really contained in it. We can only understand a man like Goethe when we realize, on the one hand, that he had studied what had formed him, really as if he had viewed it from outside, as can be seen in his memoirs, titled Truth and Poetry, and that on the other hand he knew that this must lead back to distant perspectives, to distant connections with the dead. Faust enters the life of very ancient civilizations of humanity, the life of spiritual beings lying far back in the past. However, if we want to completely understand what is necessary in the positive sense for the present, we must also take a look at the negative in many connections. We must develop the right feeling for the negative aspects of a matter. We must see everything that hinders the necessary coming together of living human beings in the same plane with the working of the dead. These hindrances can be found everywhere we go. We find them exactly where education and cultivation, forgive the ugly term, is widespread today. How really clever a certain person feels, deeply clever and enlightened, when he can write something like the following, quote, Swedenborg, around whose dark, mysterious personality even Goethe went with a reverent feeling, associated with angels beyond the earth, beyond the threshold of the senses. He has said that these super-earthly creatures even go around clothed in robes, debating thoughts. The wrestling for knowledge and enlightenment is not foreign to them. They even set up a printing press from which they themselves send down pages to particularly fortunate human beings. The newspapers on the other side of the threshold are covered with Hebrew letters. A peculiarity of the Honorable Bible picture signs is supposed to be that every stroke or line of it, every angle, every curve, is supposed to harbor a secret spiritual meaning. Human beings would only have to learn to read the angel squiggles correctly to be initiated into the truth of the other side of the threshold, into the blessed life turned away from the earthly, the blissfully festive and uplifting paradise of the next world. Swedenborg, who succeeded in dying to the earthly life while still living, and who managed to swing up into the next world before his bodily death, asked much of the angels and reported about them. Centuries before him, the Babylonians, Egyptians, and Hebrews performed the same reconnaissance. Generations after him to the present day, dissatisfied people who want to attain advice about their future from God, who do not do without the company of their dead, were of the opinion that the bridge between their bed, swirled around by dreams, and the realm of the untouchable is a firm, seraphically cemented way through thoroughly hardened and borne up by spirits. Close quote. Thus this person in question, who considers himself to be very clever, continues his reflections further, ridiculing those who attempt to build a bridge into the realm on the other side of the threshold. This clever man read the book of another person, who also thought himself quite clever, and then wrote about it. Quote, Max Dessoir's weighty book, titled Vom Jenseits der Seele, From the Far Side of the Soul, tries to describe anew this realm where the soul lives beyond the senses, after thousands of brooding types have already gone this path into the other side. This time it is a philosopher speaking, who has concerned himself more with the knowledge of human nature than with sorting out abandoned directions of thought. He is a friend of the arts, who has not shied away from interpreting the mysteriously shrouded moment of birth of an artistic plan. Finally, he is a man who occasionally, with the use of a scalpel, examines the bones and nerves of the human being to understand the many earthly hiding places of the soul. Because Max Dessoir is protected in many ways from the haste of the visionaries and the coldness of the rationalists, his judgment, which was 30 years in the making, about things of the next world, should be respected and heard also by those who cannot follow him along his path. Close quote. And so on. I had to discuss this Max Dessoir in the second chapter of my book titled Riddles of the Soul, because this university professor had the impudence to discuss anthroposophy. I had to prove that his whole manner of working was the most superficial and most irresponsible that one could imagine. He had the gall to form negative judgments of quotes from a few of my books that he had written down in an idiotically distorted form. We must indeed put the fact in this way, if we really want to see this scandal that is possible in what is frequently called science today. I only saw Max Dessoir once in my life, and that was at the beginning of the 1890s at a Goethe dinner in Weimar. He made a very clever remark to me. At that time I had not yet written my title Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path, also known as Philosophy of Freedom. Max Dessoir said, quote, Yes, you have made a mistake, though. You occupy yourself with too many different sciences. Close quote. That was the great mistake, that I tried not to be one-sided. Among the other nonsensical things that Max Dessoir did in his book was to refer to my title Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path as my firstling. In fact, I wrote it approximately 10 years after my firstling. A 10-year writing career preceded it. All of that and much more are totally false in the book by Dessoir. But how many people will read the necessary objective arguments that show what a windbag Dessoir's science is? How many people will read these objective arguments in my book titled Riddles of the Soul? How many journalistic scum of the sort from Max Hochdorf in Zurich comes together to broadcast the nonsensical book by Max Dessoir in the manner that one says, Max Dessoir's weighty book Vom Jenseits der Seele wants to describe anew this realm where the soul lives beyond the senses, after thousands of brooding types have already gone this path into the other side. And so on. It is necessary to look at such things. It is sufficiently well known that what is being attempted on the basis of anthroposophically oriented spiritual science is being distorted here and there in a most outrageous manner. And this is being done occasionally by people who know very well that what they are saying is the opposite of the truth. However, it is for the most part poor souls who cannot satisfy their personal interests within the anthroposophical society, but who thought they would be able to do so. We can have compassion for them and do not need to talk about them any further. They know best how it stands with the objective truth of what they say. However, we must take the poison that Max Dessoir has disseminated more seriously. I have to do what I can to explain the whole philosophical worthlessness of Dessoir's arguments sentence by sentence. This has to be done as long as there is not in the widest circles a healthy judgment reigning over such supposed science as that of Max Dessoir, and there are many like him, and as long as a healthy judgment does not reign over such train-bearers of the Max Dessoirs of the world, like the author of the article who could not keep himself from closing with the words, quote, "because the path into the next world is so completely blocked," close quote. Naturally, the way into the next world is blocked for the obstructed brain of Max Dessoir. Quote, "Human beings through the millennia have tried to force open the gates," close quote. Dessoir called these fighters for the despairingly definite but unreachable spirit realm, quote, "magical idealists," close quote. He named them all: faith healers, apostles of numerology, Egyptian magicians, anthroposophists, neo-Buddhists, Kabbalists. He is a highly gripping historical writer of all who accept the wonders and miracles, and of all those who are rebellious in spite of the wonders. Quote, "A peculiar brotherhood would form if one wanted to list all the men, the sages and the fools, who would want to gather together for the pure spirit: Cagliostro, Kant, Hegel, and also the modern sorcerer Svengali meet each other when they lose themselves promenading on the way into the other side or the next world," close quote. Naturally, it is not possible to prevent people from writing in this manner, but a healthy judgment must take hold in the widest circles, so that what is made public in this way will not be taken as authoritative. Because, of course, when thought forms of this kind fly around in our social organism, they prevent any possibility of beneficial progress for humanity. For our own purposes, when we must take hold of scientific rubbish, such as that from Max Dessoir, we can wash our hands of it and let that be that. However, this scientific rubbish flows, and there are too many avenues today where it can flow. Sometimes one has to set an example. It had to be done again in this case, because you can calculate how many heads a judgment of anthroposophy is drummed into when such a feature article appears like that of December 14th, 1917, in the title Neue Zürcher Zeitung, New Zurich newspaper, by a quite clever person who based his work on the just as clever Max Dessoir. We must look at these things as cultural historical facts. We must look at their cultural historical meaning. Certainly there is still only a small possibility today to bring people such a thing as the chapter I wrote, quote, "Max Dessoir on Anthroposophy," close quote. For even in the Anthroposophical Society there is only a small group of people who really understand their task: to enlighten humanity about the incorrect way and manner that science is often done, and about the proper and right way science should be done. What is done today as science is a symptom of the general way of thinking, for just as it is in science, for which Max Dessoir, with all his satellites, is a conspicuous example, so it is ordered also in other fields. And when you ask what were the deeper forces that led into today's catastrophe, you always remain at a superficial view if you do not go into these deeper reasons, when you do not go into what lies as charlatanism in the distortion and superficiality. It is a charlatanism that seeks to maintain itself in that it ascribes an earnest spirituality precisely to the charlatanism. That must, in a healthy sense, be grasped in its true form. I bring the example of Max Dessoir only because it is near at hand. However, this is an example of much of what is negative in our time. If human beings would have a heart for the positive, for the growing together with the spiritual world, then they must also have a heart for the negative, for the strong, substantial negative where it exists, in the false, the superficial, and the useless. We see that often those who are placed worst in public life are precisely those who are the most respectable. There is no need to look at these things pessimistically, but it is necessary to seek in one's soul those forces that can bring forth and cultivate a healthy judgment about these things.